of Tænketanken EUROPA and co-chair of ECFR. I guess I can still start this meeting by saying Happy New Year. Let's hope it will be slightly more predictable than the year we just had, but who knows? That's at least an open question. This seminar will be on UK and Denmark, basically answering the question, where next after the split? Remember that this session will be recorded, and also remember the household rules. Use the chat and also the raise hand functions once we get to the question and answer session. It is the final session of a series that Tænketanken EUROPA has organized together with ECFR, looking into the new coalition patterns after Brexit, and obviously also focusing upon Denmark. Where could we possibly find new friends now that Britain has left the European Union? Timothy Garton-Ash, which I'm sure is a household name to most of you on this call, wrote an interesting piece in The Guardian just after New Year's Eve, where he was making the point that Britain needs a European policy and the EU needs a Britain policy the other way around, so to speak. And he also made the point that there could be a danger that we'll end up in a trap where the EU will focus so much on making it a success now that the UK is no longer in the EU, whereas United Kingdom could be tempted constantly to make sure to underline that it was a great idea to leave the European Union and to embark upon Brexit. And that could lead to tension in the overall relationship, also because, as I'm sure that most of you are aware of, we have now a deal with the UK, but it's a deal that is basically very thin and leads to a situation where we have Brexiternity, lots of additional negotiations coming up, whatever on justice and home affairs, defense, also financial services, just to name a few issues. So lots of issues that the EU has to negotiate with in the future with the UK. What we'll do here is we'll take our starting point, as we always do with the Coalition Explorer, and we are so lucky that a new edition has been conducted looking specifically at the UK. So that will be Rafael Loos, who is the coordinator of the Pan-European Data Project at ECFR, who will basically come forward with the main conclusions there. And then we move to our second speaker, Kirsty Hughes, Director of the Scottish Centre on European and International Relations. There we have you in Edinburgh. Rafael is with us, has joined us from Berlin. I remember many years ago, Kirsty, you wrote this excellent book on enlargement, and that was also a time where I myself was really into the enlargement issue. Denmark had the EU presidency in 2002, and we had the slogan from Copenhagen to Copenhagen, because it was in Copenhagen that the original criteria for enlargement was agreed upon. And then, well, Denmark managed, with lots of help from other countries, then to close the accession negotiation with a number of countries. So that's going to be, well, we're not going to talk about enlargement, but maybe we are because of Scotland. Who knows? I'm sure that you'll say a few words of that as well, but you will also give us your view on how the new coalition pattern is developing within the European Union. But let's start with you, Rafael. Let's go to Berlin and let's hear what does the new analysis say concerning the EU and its relationship to Britain. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Lykke, for the invitation and for this opportunity to share some of the new data with you. I'm sure that some of the participants that have joined us today will have seen some of the earlier webinars that we've held as part of the series on the EU Coalition Explorer. So first, a couple of words on what this whole thing is about. Essentially, what we have done at ECFR is develop a tool, an online tool that allows everybody to assess, examine the views of policymakers and expert observers of EU affairs on their views on inner European cooperation, about policy priorities, cooperation preferences, preferred partners, and so on. And since Britain left the European Union, we thought that this time around we do the EU Coalition Explorer within the EU 27 and do a separate survey with policy experts from the UK. that gave us the opportunity to dive into some questions with the UK experts that we didn't address with the EU27 experts, such as on the future role that the UK might play in world politics. So we had about 70 UK experts join us for this effort. They shared their views with us on Britain's cooperation preferences with the EU27, about the UK's policy priorities for European politics, broadly speaking, and preferred partners. But we also asked them about maybe which member states within the European Union most opposed UK preferences. But first, let me address some of the general cooperation preferences that the UK experts revealed to us. Unsurprisingly, and this is a question that we also asked to the EU27 experts in our other survey, but here we asked what member states within the EU, the UK government generally contacts most on European policy matters. And somewhat unsurprisingly, Germany and France come in first and second place here. The Netherlands ranks quite highly as well, of course, for geographical reasons, Ireland, but Denmark makes it on the 6th place. When we look at the question of who the UK experts see as most responsive and easiest to work with for the UK government, then this is maybe a bit more of a traditional alliance network for the UK, with Netherlands and Germany playing a big role here, but Denmark on rank 4 also being placed quite prominently. Maybe the most gossipy question is that about who is most disappointing to the UK government from the perspective of those experts. And here France ranks on 1st place, Germany on 2nd place, Hungary and Poland, who take the first 2 places among the EU27, land on 3rd and 5th place respectively for the UK experts. Ireland on 4th place as well. I think the trade agreement negotiations fairly well reflect the fact that there's such a iffy relationship between the UK and France at the moment. And the fisheries question, I think, was a case in point here. Let me go to the policy priorities that the UK experts identified for us. So here we asked those 70 experts what they considered to be policy areas in which it will be of highest priority to cooperate closely with the EU27. And as you can see on the left-hand side here, climate very much ranks on 1st place, followed by market and trade issues, and then followed by sort of general foreign policy issues, including European relationships with Russia and China in particular. Defense is only sort of marginal importance. We differentiated here between defense cooperation inside and outside of the EU framework, but neither of them is particularly high in the ranking for the UK experts when it comes to close cooperation with the EU27. Now, this slide is based, as I said, on the views of the UK experts. In the survey for the EU27 experts, we asked a similar question and found that there is quite some convergence for the EU27. And again, this is based on a sample size of about 800 or so. Foreign policy, defense issues were ranked a bit higher here, but foreign policy issues, the market and trade issues and climate also were of huge importance when it came to EU27 cooperation with the UK after Brexit. The policy priorities that Denmark individually sees here very much align with the broader European trend. So there's not a lot of divergence between the EU27 when it comes to a united approach to cooperating with Britain after Brexit. And if we look at the issue of partners, focusing on those sort of top 3 policy areas, namely climate, the market, and foreign policy issues, we see that on the issue of climate policy for the UK, Germany and France are the 2 most important partners, followed by Italy, the Netherlands, Sweden, Spain. Denmark also shows up quite prominently. And Hungary and Poland, also in the context within the EU27, are identified as those two member states that oppose UK policy preferences on climate policy. On the issue of the single market and trade, similarly, you have Germany and France being quite important for the UK in solving various issues, as we've seen in the recent negotiations coming up to the Christmas Day deal that was finally concluded before the end of the year. Of course, with the Irish border question, Ireland is of huge importance here as well, as are the Netherlands as a sort of traditional ally of the UK's. Yeah. But again, Denmark is also represented in this listing. When we look at foreign policy issues, which are sort of less importance compared to climate and trade issues, but still of relatively great importance compared to some of the other issues. Germany and France, again, take the first and second place, and traditional allies of the UK's like Italy, like the Netherlands, like Sweden, being represented here as well. And again, also Denmark shows up. When we look at the issue of defense policy, and again, we made this difference between cooperation inside and outside of the EU framework, it is unsurprising that for defense cooperation with the UK within EU framework formats, Denmark does not really show up, presumably because of all the opt-outs that Denmark has implemented for itself and navigated in the past as well. But if we look at defense cooperation outside of EU frameworks, then Denmark is seen by some UK experts as an important partner here. But of course, Germany and France, Poland, the Netherlands, Italy are seen as partners on defense policy as well. So if we consider the sort of, I think, three broad policy areas, climate, trade, and foreign policy cooperation, I think there are a couple of sort of concrete policy ideas that the UK and the EU27 might drive forward in the future, beyond the sort of minimal baseline that the Christmas Day deal, the trade agreement that was negotiated before the end of the year, outlines. And that includes on climate, for instance, of course, the great opportunity that the UN Climate Conference COP26 presents for the UK to present itself as a sort of leader on the world stage and to drive forward an ambitious climate agenda. Boris Johnson outlined a 10-point plan for the Green Industrial Revolution in November. The EU, of course, has its own European Green Deal with a very ambitious agenda in terms of regulations and spending priorities. And I think there is a lot of potential there for synergies in spending and policy priorities if the UK and the EU27 or the EU coordinate. And that includes issues like the emissions trading system, for instance. The UK has announced that it wants to set up its own system, but aligning the two systems, I think, would create some benefits for both sides. Countries like Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland have shown that coordination is possible there. Those three countries participate in the European emissions trading system, and similarly with the national contributions that countries are supposed to submit as part of the Paris Agreement. The European Economic Area as a whole submits a common plan, and that includes countries like Norway and Iceland. So we have a club of countries that submit a common set of emissions reductions and climate adaptation goals, but that doesn't prevent any one member state of this club to submit even higher national goals. So this might be a model if the UK and the EU seek convergence on environmental policy to work together and establish a common baseline. But the UK, if it wants to really make use of this leadership opportunity that it presents itself with COP26, could even exceed those goals. The second policy area, trade and single market issues, of course, we now have a sort of baseline deal. So I think open to be seen how robust really the mechanisms are that the EU and the UK agreed to as part of the deal. But they set up a lot of committees and different forums to sort of weed out any disagreements in the future. But of course, both have a global agenda, I think, as well that warrants close cooperation. One very obviously is sort of Wto reform. I think that's a common agenda for the UK, for the EU, for the new Biden administration as well, where I think close cooperation within the club of Western democracies could yield great benefits and sort of considering broader issues, the strengthening of the sort of rules-based international order, of which the WTO is part, is on the agenda of the EU and the UK and the coming Biden administration as well. And the UK will host a G7 meeting soon. So this is again another opportunity for the Johnson government to promote an ambitious and pragmatic agenda on revitalizing the international trade treaty. Finally, on the issue of foreign policy and defense, I think we're all sort of anxiously awaiting the integrated review that the UK has postponed a number of times now. I think it's supposed to come out at the end of the month or in February. We'll see if that happens. But the UK, throughout the Brexit process, of course, has emphasized that it remains committed to European security, that it is, of course, still a member of NATO and therefore closely involved with European security and defense issues. This integrated review for us, the expert community, but also, of course, the British government agencies, will spell out what this idea of global Britain actually means, what interests lie behind it, what resources the UK government intends to commit those goals, and where it sees sort of areas that would warrant cooperation with other global powers, including the EU, the US, and other power centers around the world. But on the EU side, I think there is cooperation formats that have been established already and that seem to be working quite well. In the context of the Iran deal, for example, you have this cooperation between the EU, between the EU as part of it as well, but between France, Germany, and the UK. I think that might be a format that the three might drive forward into the future, that could be upgraded into something like a European Security Council. That's a concept that has been discussed in the past numerous points. And if the EU wants to keep the UK involved in those discussions, then of course a format like that might make sense as a formal institution. And then of course the opening up of the permanent structured cooperation of the common security and defense policy is a welcome sign that the EU side is cognizant and willing to include third countries in common projects that goes in the direction, of course, that's a signal in the direction of the United States, but also to the UK, that is now a third country. And so finding language that allows the EU to include important allies and partners, but also to not invite countries that it might not want to have included in PESCO projects in the future, I think was a tricky issue to figure out. But I think the solution that they come up with at the end of last year is one that should help the EU to cooperate closely with the UK and other global partners.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And thank you for reminding us of the two important events, at least, that Britain is chairing the G7 and is also chairing the COP26. Before I give the floor to Kirsty, I cannot resist quoting from The Economist. They had a major piece just around New Year's Eve where they made the following point. The UK could become a big Denmark, a decent North European place without great power pretensions. Well, that was a quote for you there, Kirsty. And obviously, we're also interested in where you are, Edinburgh, sort of once that that discussion develops even further about possible independence. I mean, how could that sort of affect the overall relationship between the UK and the EU? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luca. It's great to be here. Good morning, everybody. It's a very interesting time, isn't it? We've now, we're waiting for Biden to be inaugurated tomorrow, finally. And that in many ways, I think, makes the UK look more lonely as it finally 2 weeks ago left the EU's single market and customs union. And that's required a lot of rethinking for everybody, and it's going to require a lot more rethinking and reshuffling, I think. Fairly obviously, and I think the introductory blurb for this meeting said this, the UK and Denmark used to have quite a lot in common. We joined the European Union at the same time. We were the two member states with formal opt-outs from the euro. Luca's already mentioned our common interests in the crucial 2004 enlargement, that sort of free market leaning and all that sort of thing. But that has gone now. It's very much gone. And so we have to see where next. And also we have to see what impact that has had on the European Union. I think it's been very obvious in the last almost 5 years. The impact on the UK's politics has been extraordinary and mostly negative, and we're now seeing very negative and unsurprising impacts on the economy as well. But there have been very big impacts in the European Union, not necessarily as damaging as some people feared, but nonetheless quite profound, I think. I wrote 2 papers last year relevant to today's discussion. One last March looked at small states in the EU, partly to see what Scotland could learn from those states, but also to see how smaller EU member states were responding to Brexit. And then I did another paper just a month ago in December, a more qualitative version of some of the questions Rafael's been asking, to ask how different EU member states now look at the UK and also Scotland and the potential for a future relationship. In doing that, I did about 30 in-depth interviews across about half of the member states. So some of the comments I'm going to make draw on what I learned from those interviews. I think one of the points that came up repeatedly and in a lot of different ways from people, whether in Paris or Prague or Copenhagen or Stockholm and elsewhere, was just the range and depth of alliances that the United Kingdom had with different member states. And it made for some very sad listening. You kind of feel if only some of that could have been got across during and before the 2016 referendum. When you hear the Czechs talk about the UK's support for enlargement, but it's their sympathy for its support on Russia policies, or you talk to the Dutch and the Danish about free market policies, Sweden about climate change or even human rights. Or even in Italy, sometimes we think of some of the southern member states as taking rather different stances to those that the UK used to take. But nonetheless, a lot of interest in what the UK used to do, how professional it was. We were seen as a very pragmatic country, and also as a balance to some extent to the Franco-German relationship and the inevitable power of that relationship. So that's also now history, but it's quite important history. And it's obviously important in particular for what member states have been doing since that vote. And it was very striking in my research and interviews for the paper I did last March, how much rethinking was going on. Now, if you look at a smaller member state next door to the UK, like Ireland, you see that it had an extraordinary and rethinking, very effective rethinking of its global foreign policy. The EU is fundamentally important to Ireland, but it's also got to have a good relationship with its big neighbour, the UK, and then the US is very important to Ireland. But it was rethinking its relationships across the EU. It's made quite a big investment into Germany, but it's also looked at other more distant member states. I think if we look at our typical coalitions, we often see neighborhood clusters as well as interest clusters. And it was very striking talking to people from Portugal to Finland to Hungary, that a lot of diplomats and politicians are thinking about, well, how do we intensify that relationship with Greece? Or what are Estonia's concerns about the Eastern Partnership that we've not really thought about very much? How do we show we're going to be good partners in the future? Now, that's not all done to be nice, obviously. It's done to think, how do you rethink your influence as a member state when you used to spend a lot of time relating in part to the United Kingdom? And we've seen, and again, this isn't only due to Brexit, but we've seen in the last few years a tendency for quite a lot of new as well as older, what I would call like-minded groups in the EU. They may be fairly informal, but we see them coming up when 8 or 12 member states write to the presidency ahead of a summit on climate change, or they write on the Green New Deal, or they write on industrial strategy. We've seen the Hanseatic League develop, for instance. We've seen like-minded groups around the single market. So I think Brexit has to some extent reinforced that a lot, and to some extent given a new dynamic to the way European diplomats are thinking about alliance formation in the EU. Alongside that, and completely unsurprisingly, but when you do a set of interviews, it's still quite shocking if you ask what member states think of the UK today, and you're off the record, you get some very blunt answers. There's a major loss of trust. There's a certain degree of contempt, almost humor, some schadenfreude. And the word that came up a lot was the word baffled. People see what the UK has done to itself as so self-destructive and damaging that despite all the analysis of why and what, people are also baffled. I think the loss of reputation, the loss of influence, and the loss of trust are all extremely important. That trust is not going to come back in a hurry. And so when we look at Danish-UK relations, or we look at EU-UK relations, we have to bear that in mind. Politics can move fast sometimes, but we've got the Boris Johnson government undermine trust more than the Theresa May one. He obviously not just threatened to renege on the withdrawal agreement, but actually introduced a bill, the Internal Market Bill, to the House of Commons last autumn that formally was going to renege on the withdrawal agreement. And the fact that we've now got out of that and we've got the new trade and cooperation agreement obviously doesn't take away that lack of trust. At the same time, and as Rafael made clear, people are pragmatic. In search of a whole range of interests and values, and the UK is still like it or not, it is a European country. It's not in the EU, but it's a significant island off the continent of Europe. And obviously there's a lot of interest in a positive future EU-UK relationship if that can be created. The degree of interest in that certainly varies. I talked to people in The Hague who said they were still fascinated by British politics, or people in Prague who said they really weren't paying much attention anymore. And I'm not sure if Denmark is maybe in between, or is it a bit more like The Hague? Although at the moment, obviously, Denmark has become the port of choice for Scottish fishermen, as you may have noticed, as we struggle to deal with the trade and cooperation agreement. That left me rushing to Twitter to ask if anyone could tell me how that was allowed under the new agreement, but apparently it is, but I'm not the expert on that one. Where does this leave the state of the UK? I think the UK is in a very deep political mess. There's an obvious urge to move on, as it were. We've got the deal. We'll have to live with that for now. We can do all the things that Rafael talked about. We can try and get some cooperation going on foreign policy. We can do climate. We can try and iron out some of the hiccups in the deal. But I don't think that should hide the fact in any way that UK politics is in a very bad place. Brexit was an ideology, and it's still an ideology. It was based on a lot of lies and exaggeration. It involved a lot of propaganda. And so when we say, Lykke referred to the Timothy Garton-Ash article, are we going to see a lot of EU-UK friction in the future, with the UK carrying on blaming the EU, even though it's now got its sunny global Britain Brexit up plans? Or are we going to see a more mature relationship? I think it's going to be a mixture of things. I think we're certainly going to see a certain amount of British still blaming the EU, although what we see so far, is not the queues at Dover and Calais that we feared, but actually the real problem at the moment is the lack of queues when the hauliers don't want to come to Britain. The non-tariff barriers are so big. So we hear people like Michael Gove saying, oh, well, we've just got to iron these things out. You know, you've got the west of Scotland shellfish, seafood fishermen saying they're about to go bankrupt. And they've got Jacob Rees-Mogg in the House of Commons laughing about British fish, and Michael Gove saying you just need to iron things out. You've also got, I think, if you look at the Financial Times this morning, you see Boris Johnson hosting a session with British business about how he's going to exploit all these wondrous opportunities we now face. So we're going to invest in skills and innovation, and all the things we could have, of course, invested in while we were still in the European Union. But there's a serious point to all this. This means the dishonesty around Brexit and the ideology around Brexit, it has to continue for this government. That may not mean turning around and being rude to the EU or blaming the EU all the time, but it can't be honest. When you've just put extraordinary non-tariff barriers in the way of your economy, you've actually done a deal, and this is very ironic in the Scottish context, you've done a deal to segment Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK. You've fragmented your state. So you can't afford to admit to what you've done. And so just like we've seen with Trump and American politics, this pernicious undermining of basic facts and a degree of honesty in politics, I think is with us for the immediate future. Some people look to the Labour opposition leader Keir Starmer with hope, but he's playing the long game to the next election in 2024. And the problem with that is he's choosing not to be critical or very critical of the UK-EU trade and cooperation agreement. He's not making a big deal about all these non-tariff barriers. He doesn't want to be called a Remainer, and that's rather tying his hands behind his back. And interestingly, this week, we also saw the now very small Liberal Democratic Party, their leader, Ed Davey, said the Lib Dems were no longer a rejoin party, and that they had been the one pan-UK rejoin party. The Scottish National Party obviously wants independence in the EU, but now we have the Lib Dems saying they want to be close but not rejoin. Now, I don't think, from the people I talked to from my various interviews, nobody's in a great rush to have the UK back. Even a decade for most people, a decade's time is too soon. But nonetheless, it tells you something about the way the discussion is going here in the UK. And I think on the foreign policy side, we'll see indeed with the integrated review. There was a very good analysis in Politico the other day of John Bew, the historian who's been brought in to advise on that and to try apparently to stop it being a completely retro imperial global Britain effort and more a sort of power broker maybe global Britain. But I think we're going to see that's going to impact on the EU and UK in the foreign policy area, where there's a lot of disappointment from the member states that Britain didn't want to set up structured foreign policy cooperation. But this is all again about ideology. Boris Johnson wants Britain to be seen as working with Australia and Canada and the US, the Five Eyes. He wants to perhaps expand the G7 to be a D10. And when you look at the fact that he agreed in the trade agreement that we would stay part of Horizon but not Erasmus, this again is pure ideology. We mustn't have young young Brits being too European, or the European health insurance card actually thankfully still exists, but it's called the global health insurance card. Anyway, I'm running out of time, so let me just say a couple more things. Two sentences on Scotland and independence. The independence debate is not going away. It predates Brexit, it predates COVID. Remember, we had 45% yes in 2014. I think the demographics of the support for independence are very important. We see from recent polls that about 3/4 of people under 45 would vote yes in an independence referendum. Scotland remains a pro-EU country. It's a very different country and a very different politics these days to England. And it looks to its neighbours, it looks to Ireland, it looks to Denmark, it looks to countries of similar size to it to see what it can learn from those countries. And I think it's also, you know, if one's thinking about Danish-British relationships into the future, which are clearly going to have to be pragmatic, at least while we still have the Johnson government, and trying to look at maybe non-governmental ways to interact. But again, there are interesting lessons there from Ireland. The Irish government has put a lot of effort, firstly, despite the damage to it of Brexit, of maintaining relations with the British government, but also, apart from the importance to it of the relations with Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement, it has always, in recent years, had a very serious political consul general figure in Edinburgh, and it's recently put a new consul general into Cardiff in Wales. So Ireland has not stood back from relating to Wales and Scotland just because of the sensitivities around independence. And indeed, at the end of last week, the Irish and Scottish governments brought out a very interesting report on ways to cooperate in future in culture, sport, education, research. So I think, you know, I think there is scope there for Denmark and Scotland to do things together. And I think there doesn't have to be too much sensitivity around the fact that nonetheless the independence debate will carry on raging, and we have elections in the Scottish Parliament this May. I'd better leave it there. I think I've overstepped my time, but I hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much. And I think it was also interesting that you mentioned sort of the Erasmus sort of a point that Northern Ireland will still be able to participate in the Erasmus program, apparently financed by the Irish government. So I think that is one of the sort of important sort of questions to look into in the future. I mean, to what extent will you see EU member states trying to develop some kind of bilateral cooperation with the European Union? I'll probably ask you about that in a second, Kirsty. But before I do that, I just want to refer to you just want to sort of come forward with some news of interesting analysis that ECFR is publishing with Tænketanken EUROPA just in a couple of hours' time, where we have asked sort of basically also Danish population. I mean, which country do you think is the most important country for Denmark to have a very close relationship to? And there the answer is very clear. It is 53% saying Germany. So then it's 33% of the Danish public saying United States of America. And then it's only 9% of the Danish public then sort of pointing to the United Kingdom. So I think that sort of, although we can't sort of make any comparison because this sort of poll was not conducted earlier, it still sort of gives you a clear impression that the UK is moving very far down the list, whereas Germany is moving up. But before I give you the floor again, Kirsty, we have a question to you from, let's just see here in my chat here, the former chairman of the Danish Europe Committee, so the very important committee, as I'm sure you both know, in the Danish Folketing. So Claus Larsen Jensen, over to you, and you are actually also heading now a reform committee that the Danish Europe Committee has set up, looking into sort of, I presume, the anniversary of Denmark's EU membership. So Claus Larsen Jensen, can you hear us? The floor is yours. There you are.
Yes, okay, you can hear me?
Absolutely, and we can see you.
Okay.
Yeah? Lots of books.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for interesting interventions here. I have a couple of questions because, and maybe it's it's hitting the point or not hitting the point, but nevertheless, you can talk about a new kind of bilateral relation between the UK and Denmark and other EU member states. But one thing I'm focusing at is the role of civil society organizations, employers associations, unions in the UK, and their relation to the European network or organizations. I think I've seen, at least among the civil society organizations, that they are leaning back, and some of them have left European network, which I think is a big mistake. I don't think the unions do. I don't think the employers associations do. But my question to you in that relation is, how is the reaction among civil society organizations, unions, and employers associations at this moment in the UK, in Scotland, looking at the future? Then a question more related to Scotland. What's happening there right now? Is it pushing you towards a referendum, or is it status quo, or what is happening? And then a last question, which is related to the political mess you talk about in the UK. You have Johnson government right now, but you never know. You can get a change if Labour is winning an election. I don't know if they can, but if they do you see any chance of changes? I don't believe that they will be able to get back the UK at this moment inside the European Union. I mean, I've also heard what all the Labour people are saying, but there could maybe be a change in the position in the areas of cooperation and agreements with EU member states. So these small questions to you.
Excellent. So Kirsty, 3 questions in a row. Can you handle all of them?
Okay, thank you. I should be brief, but yeah, I think on your first point, I think it's very important that as many networks as possible are maintained. We're not going to stop being European just because the government in London tells us we should stop being European. I'm sorry if you've heard of groups, civil society groups withdrawing from European networks. Certainly the ones I've talked to, I know have been very keen to find ways to stay connected. And there are, I think, both formal and informal Friends of the UK and Friends of Scotland groups in the European Parliament. I know the German MEP, Terry Reintke, has said she really hopes there's ways people in Britain could contribute to the Future of Europe conference when that gets going, for instance. And I think the more we can maintain and keep those despite the new barriers, the better. You know, where the UK and Scotland goes next is our responsibility. It's not your responsibility. But when you see the sort of propaganda I was talking about, the reasons for withdrawing from Erasmus, the reasons for withdrawing from the European health insurance card is somehow an aim that we should think of ourselves as global Anglo-Saxons and not Europeans, then I think we have to counter that for the next few years until we do perhaps and hopefully get a more pragmatic and more pro-European government. So let me jump on that to your third question. I think at the moment it's very difficult for Labour to win without doing much better in Scotland. So actually Labour's prospects also depend on the nature of the independence debate, and Labour struggles for a lot of reasons to quite know how to face up to that. I think if you did get a Keir Starmer government in 4 years' time, you would expect both a better tone and more cooperation, especially some of this cooperation on foreign policy that people are keen to see. You might be able to reintroduce Erasmus. I think that the big problem with Brexit all along, though, is that I've had a lot of debates in the last 4.5 years with those who wanted a soft Brexit, those who wanted the UK to stay in the EU's single market and customs union. And I didn't see how that was sustainable. How could a medium-sized country like the UK become a permanent rule taker across its trade policy and the whole single market space. It would create a substantial democratic deficit. So I think there's going to be problems in moving backwards, and I'm not sure that that problem is free movement. Keir Starmer said he's no longer in favour of free movement, though last year he said he was in favour of it. But at the end of the day, I think the problem is going to be that democratic control one. Nonetheless, as we see all the problems that are mounting, even just in the first 2 weeks here, maybe there is quite a lot that could be done in a pragmatic way. Scotland, what's happening? I think there's going to be an increasingly strong demand for a referendum. At the moment, the polls suggest that the Scottish National Party, the current Scottish government, is on course for a landslide at the start of May. Boris Johnson keeps saying we can't have another referendum, that it's once in a generation. But I don't think that's going to be acceptable. And I don't either think it's acceptable for the Labour opposition to keep describing the pro-independence people as somehow extremists and nationalists and unreasonable. You can't label 3/4 of people under 45 who want self-determination and to be in the EU. You can't simply insult those people. So I don't know when there'll be a referendum, and I don't know how there'll be a referendum. There's a lot of discussion in Scotland on what they call Plan Bs. What can we do that will be legally and constitutionally sound? Because people are well aware that they don't want Scotland to end up looking like Catalonia, whatever sympathies there are for Catalonia in Scotland. So I think we're on track somehow or another. That my best guess it would be for a referendum in the coming years. And at the moment, that referendum is very likely to be won. And of course, there is a strong interconnection, despite them being very different politics, between Northern Ireland and Scotland. So Northern Ireland could have a border poll. It's not expected to do that imminently. But if Scotland went ahead, had a referendum and voted yes to independence, it would really turbocharge the Northern Irish debate. And there's also Brexit and the mishandling of the COVID crisis here has even strengthened support for independence in Wales. So the fragmentation of the UK is a core issue for the coming years.
Excellent. There are already a number of sort of interesting comments in the chat, so I also refer you to the chat. But now we go to Anne Dayton. Would you please introduce yourself?
Yes, hello everybody. My name's Anne Dayton from the University of Oxford. I thought that Kirsty's analysis was one of the best that I've heard about what's happened to Britain over the last 4 and a bit years. And I completely agree with her that that the referendum was a destructive act. If you go back, as I do as a historian, to why we joined the European community, it was to find a new power base. The documents of the time talk very much about power projection, using the European community as a source of power, much encouraged by the United States at the time. And we've now knocked that away. And just as an observation, I think we've put a lot of institutional strain upon NATO. And I know that people like to think of NATO as a given, as an independent variable, but I think we have to watch that as a continent. But my 2 questions for Kirsty are as follows. When you did your survey, Kirsty, did you get the feeling that the people within the European Union that you spoke to thought Britain was not trying just to leave the European Union, but was also trying to undermine it? This is one of the subtexts of what has been going on in the UK, and we've slightly pushed it to one side, but I wouldn't blame our European friends for remembering those attitudes. The second question is how we look forward. And you've hinted, as both speakers did, that there might be a trend towards bilateralism. Now, my question is that surely this push for bilateralism also could undermine the European Union and its institutions. And although it sounds easy, and bilateralism is a sort of easy politics built on personalities and individuals, and as you say, Kirsty, interest-based relationships and networks, but it seems to me quite a dangerous position. And I'd be very interested to know what Kirsty thinks of the paper that's done recently by Robin Niblett from Chatham House, where he returns to this question of Britain not being a global power, but some sort of power broker, you know, like the merchant in the middle of the commercial deal, which seems to me coming very much from the John Bew point of view. So thank you very much.
Excellent, thanks. And we'll try to put the various sort of papers that have been mentioned on our webpage so you can sort of read them. That goes for the ECFR study, the study that you mentioned, or the article by Robert Nipland, and obviously also your various papers, Kirsty. If you could also send them to us, that would be helpful. But over to you, undermining the EU and sort of the bilateralism in the relationship between the EU and Britain. I'd also like to ask Rafael to comment on that, but over to you, Kirsty.
Yes, thanks, Anne. It's nice to see you. Thanks for those comments. I didn't get so many comments on the UK trying to undermine the EU. I think partly because by last year, everything had moved on so much. You know, the EU had showed that it wasn't going to be undermined by Brexit, that it was able to stay united, that if anything, it was actually one of the most positive things in the last few years, driving unity, not division in the EU. So yes, a few comments, but not as many as you might have got 3 or 4 years ago. And I think for people, the contrast between how the EU was managing and the state of the UK was so sharp that, and in many countries, I think, including Denmark, support for the EU has gone up since Brexit, not down. And I mean, interestingly, when I was asking people their views about Scotland potentially being independent in the EU and what the politics of that look like in their member state, quite a few people said, oh, well, of course, our right-wing Eurosceptic parties won't like it, because the idea of Scotland being independent but pro-EU would be anathema to maybe right-wing nationalists, which was interesting. But having said that, I think on your second question, I think you're quite right. I think bilateralism could risk undermining EU unity to some extent. I think people are aware of this, especially again in the foreign policy context. If the UK is not going to have structured EU-UK dialogue, is it then going to mainly use the E3 format and just deal with France and Germany? And that sets up a lot of challenges for smaller member states, and they don't want to have to just dialogue indirectly with the UK. I talk to people in Paris and Berlin who are perfectly aware of that and who say, no, we wouldn't let that happen because we're used to having to manage the diversity of sizes and interests within the EU. But I think that's a real issue, but it's an issue at least that people are alert to. And finally, yes, I think the Robin Niblett paper does seem to prefigure what we may get in the integrated review. At one level, there's nothing wrong with being, I don't really like the phrase power broker, but if you're going to try and play a sensible but medium-sized country role in the world, that's fine. But if you have grandiose ideas of what that means, it's just by chance that this year Britain's co-chairing the COP and the G7. Next year it won't be. So I don't think there's any serious recognition of the extent of damage to Britain's reputation and influence. The reputation could be rebuilt, the influence much less so. We are now less influential outside the EU. So I don't think we're going to sort that out in a great hurry, because the problem of Brexit and the problem of the UK is the problem of English politics. And I think English politics is going to take an English nationalism, and that's going to take several years at least to sort out.
Several years to sort out, okay. That sounds realistic, I must say. Rafael, would you like to say a few words on the importance of question of bilateralism? Because I mean, that strikes me as extremely important. I mean, sort of also for Denmark. I mean, should we somehow try to develop a bilateral relationship with the UK, and on what issues sort of could that possibly be?
Right. Yeah, I would say that I completely agree with Kirsty here, and I would add that of course it depends on the policy area that you're looking at, whether bilateralism is a problem or might become a problem. If we look at the Brexit negotiations and the negotiations for the trade agreement, you didn't really see the EU member states being divided on the issue. There was full support for Michel Barnier. Irish interests were backed by the continental Europeans to a large extent. There was a certain veto player role that was granted essentially to the Irish because of the border issues. If you look at the issue of foreign policy and defense, I think EU structures and processes sort of invite a certain bilateralism, to be honest, because of the issue of unanimity that's required on a lot of issues, and the fact that and you saw that with the Belarus sanctions and the issue of Turkish actions in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the issue linkage that was made there by Cyprus in blocking sanctions on Belarus, because the other EU member states wouldn't agree to sanction Turkey as well. Of course, you can't generate unanimity as easily there, and so this sort of structure invites that the member states and third countries seek out areas where they can cooperate and do so productively. And I think that would not necessarily be a problem in the future of EU and UK sort of member state relationships. As for your second question, Lykke, I think just based on the sort of convergence of priorities between the EU27 and the UK, but also between Denmark and the UK, those three policy areas that I've highlighted earlier, the global interest in a rules-based international order, facilitating international trade, the issue of climate change, and the issue of where European countries, including the UK, can cooperate to promote interests vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis China in the European neighborhood, but beyond that as well. From the German perspective, there's a greater interest to become involved, and there was a strategy document that was released recently to become involved in the Indo-Pacific region, and there the UK would be a preferred partner, of course. The UK has led on China policy when it comes to Hong Kong to a great extent, when it comes to human rights violations on the side of the Chinese. And so cooperation with the UK on all those kinds of issues would be well advised, I think, on the side of the Europeans.
Okay, thank you very much. Our time is up, unfortunately. I think we could go on for another hour, but that's not possible. I think you have both sort of started this discussion now, also kickstart discussion also in Denmark now. I mean, how do we develop this so-called special relationship between the EU and Britain, and what are also areas, potential areas that Denmark could start a policy with United Kingdom? I mean, that will be sort of two issues that's going to be important for this year, but probably also for a couple of years, as Kirsty was highlighting. We'll try to put the various papers, as I said, on the webpage, and do also have a look at that ECFR Tænketanken EUROPA poll that I mentioned. It will be published later today. It is an opinion poll that also looks into how has the relationship between the various member states and the United States developed, but obviously also how has the COVID crisis affected the support or the opposite of the various member states with the European Union. So I think that's going to be an important sort of paper to look into. And without further ado, thank you very much for listening in. And I can see that basically all of those who sort of started sort of listening into this important seminar have remained on the line. So I think that is the best sort of evaluation one can get these days. Rafael and Kirsty, you have sort of done an excellent job. So thank you very much. And as I started out saying, Happy New Year, and we'll try to do other webinars in the future. So thank you very much and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.